Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's quite a difficult task after the lectures you followed previously, because Professor Veres gave an excellent overview about the development of civil codifications, not only in Balkans, but also in other areas of Southern and Eastern Europe. And to my colleagues from Croatia and Serbia, they represented their civil codification efforts. And of course, Slovenia is the third country from former Yugoslavia which will be represented here. The last fourth one will be Bosnia later. And of course, the situation is quite the same, so it's quite difficult for me to tell you something new, but I will try. I'm very glad that Professor Veres mentioned that the area of Slovenia was the area where two most important codification from the 18th century was enforced as an official source of law. Starting, nevertheless, that the Slovenian people, we always mention that Slovenia was part of Austro-Hungarian Empire, but for a very short period of time, in the time of Illyrian provinces, the Slovenia was part of French Empire, and at the beginning, the first civil code which was enforced in Slovenia was the French Civil Code for a very short period of time. Of course, later, in 1814, the Austrian Civil Code came in force, and what is quite interesting, some provisions of Austrian Civil Code, the Slovenian courts used till year 2003. Because some part of classical civil codification, they were not regulated by Yugoslav law, and it was a rule that in such case, the old law, what means the Austrian Civil Code, could be used as legal rules. It was not an official source of law, the Austrian Civil Code, but it was it still remained in force in this way. So let's go back to former Yugoslavia. I have to apologize, but I had an important meeting, and I had to be present on our Senate meeting today, and I jumped a little bit outside in time of presentations of my colleagues. And you probably see this situation, especially on the top. The legislative power in former Yugoslavia was divided among the federal state and the federal republics. And therefore, it was quite clear that there's no competence, no legislative competence. There was no competent body for adopting the comprehensive civil code in Yugoslavia. As it was mentioned, the law on obligations from year 78, law on property relations from year 80, and two other parts of classical on Pandect-based civil codification were Inheritance Act from 1976. This was Act of Republic of Slovenia, and the same was with family law. The act was called Marriage and Family Relations Act. The both acts were adopted in 1976. And then we came slowly to the year 1991. On the 25th of June, Slovenia got the independence, and what happened then? The Independence Day, it's a short break in time, and of course it's not possible to change the legal system immediately. The first number of Slovenian official journal contained some important legal documents, but of course, it's also the problem of the civil law must be solved, and here we got a special rule, okay, which has already been mentioned. Professor Veres mentioned the law about after the Second World War, and with this very simple law and rule, the state of Yugoslavia simply annulled all old law before 1945. It was said 1941, but it means 1945. And the new state adopted in 1991 the same approach. The regulation and other general acts enforced on the date of the proclamation of this constitution shall remain in force. The provisions of regulation which did not comply with this constitution should be harmonized by December 31st, 1993 at the latest. So, for example, in Slovenia, we still use in field of bill of exchange the old Yugoslav bill of exchange law from 1948. It was a little bit strange because in former Yugoslavia we didn't have the public notary as a legal service, and the competencies of public notaries was on the court, but later the public notary was introduced, and the only change, for example, in bill of exchange law was the transfer of competence of court to the public notaries. Otherwise, the law remained the same. And that happened also with old different civil laws. They remained in force, and because of this date, 31st of December 1993, the discussion started, what shall we do now with the codification? The first Minister of Justice of Slovenia, he's still alive, and he's a professor of public law at my faculty. I remembered quite well that he came to the faculty and said, "My dear colleagues, you will have a lot of work in further days. We shall adopt all necessary new acts in 2 years. I will find money. I will engage you in the process." But what happened? Till 1993, of course, it was not possible to change the legal system on one hand, and on the other hand, it was a strong opposition of such approach between judges. Judges were much more conservative as professors concerning the question of changing the legislation. They said, okay, but why? Why shall we just change some concepts which function quite well just because the origin of these acts and rules are in former state we didn't like, and in former regime we also didn't like. That shows quite clearly that some basic principles of private law are so general that even in time of socialism, it was impossible to find better solutions. For example, the definition of sale, the definition of easement, and some other basic concepts, they have their roots in the human society. So, it was quite simple for the courts. The courts have just ceased to apply individual legal provisions which were contrary to the Constitution. For example, in our Inheritance Act from 1976, it was a rule that the person who escaped from the country not to serve the Yugoslav army is not competent for inheritance, to be inherited. And of course, there was no need to annul this rule. The courts simply stopped to use such stupid and ancient rule. That means that there was no necessity to hurry up, and we today got the same picture. I really doubt that Slovenia will ever adopt the comprehensive civil code, and I think I'm quite convinced that we remain with 4 different legal acts which together form the usual civil codification. What is good in such situation? There's no question, is family law part of civil codification or not? It's a separate law, separate act, which is part of a civil law. What is bad? We don't have general rules. And sometimes I see that it's a lack of definitions and of some basic principles. But even these lacks could be filled with a proper explanation and proper use of some general principles which are put in the Constitution. So we got the obligation code in 2001. It was adopted in the autumn 2001, and it came in force on 1st of January 2002. And what is quite important, we have only one amendment to this law in 2078 with just 2 articles, 2 very short articles. Why this is so important? Because in Slovenia, many acts are permanently changed, are permanently in process of changing. For example, the Companies Act from 1993, we have already had 20 amendments to this act. And this year, we will get the 21st. Of course, some of them are consequences of EU directives, but of course, some of them are the ideas mostly of our politics. So, the obligation code, based on former law of obligation of former Yugoslavia, it abolished the influence of social property and, of course, regulated some new areas. For example, the gift was not regulated in Yugoslav law and obligations till 2002. We used the Austrian rules about the gift, and now the gift is regulated in obligation code from 2002. It was a very similar situation with property code. It was adopted a year later. It came into force a year later, and it was the same approach. The basic rule from former law and property relations remained, and we abolished the influence of social property and also regulated some new areas. The Inheritance Act remained the same. It has already been the Slovenian legal act, and it got the amendments in 2001 and 2013. And we have quite an interesting situation with family code. The new family code is from 2019 and came into force on 15th of April. There were some amendments this year, but before that, we got the family code in 2011. And the civil initiative collected 40,000 signs for a referendum about the family code. Why? The definition of family, the definition of marriage, and the right of same-sex partners to adopt the child. The first family code was rejected on referendum 2012. 55% of voters were against the new law, and 45% for, and it was not enough. So then the Constitutional Court adopted some new decisions about the discrimination, and now the new family code was successfully enacted in 2019. It was, of course, again a threat with the referendum, but the Constitutional Court rejected the possibility. This is the main sources. I will focus just on the main two topics. Of course, we have a number of other legal acts amending the field of obligations and property. It's quite the same situation as in Croatia, and one of the most discussed topics was the question of consumer protection. Fortunately, there is a very prosaic reason why consumer protection regulation is outside of obligation code. The competence for consumer protection is in Ministry for Economic Affairs, and the competence for obligation code is on the Ministry on Justice, because they cannot make together a new proposal of how to integrate it. The consumer protection in civil code, we have to separate it. We have two separate fields of obligations. In property law, we got, as I said before, we have a quite modern system of land register, but very serious problem as in Croatia with managing the condominium. And beside the basic rule, which are very liberal in property code, we have a special regulation for condominium, for management of condominium, in case that they are in condominium also the apartments. And in this case, the solution is not so liberal, and we have quite strict rules how to manage the condominium, not only the consensus, but also the qualified voting. Not to be too long, I just want to represent you a very interesting amendment to property code, which is adopted in 2020, and this is the concept of so-called connected real estates. Here you have a picture of a nice neighborhood of small houses, and what could happen? Some of them, today they're quite spread in Slovenia, that you have to put your recycle island, so-called recycled island, but this recycled island, these containers for dustbins, they are not allowed to be on the public land. So, in many cases, there's a special land plot which is in co-ownership of 10 or 12 or 8 house owners. And of course, this could be, by general rules, a co-ownership. But what could happen? One owner transferred the property on land plot where stood his house, but he forgot to transfer the co-ownership on the land plot with this recycling island. What happened in these cases? So in 2020, the amendments to property code introduced so-called connected real estate, what means that two land plots could be put together as unity. And of course, this unity is put in the land register. The legal base for this connection is the legal act, and the owner, the co-owner or owner of the connected connected real estate, ancillary real estate we call it, is the owner of the other real estate. And they, in legal transaction, construct a unity. And with one transfer of property right, with one transfer of ownership, at the same time, the ownership on main real estate and the ancillary real estate are transferred together. And in now 3 years, it has already been quite a number of these situations. Not to be too long, I will not focus another question which is open. As you see, our Ministry of Justice is very conservative toward the changing of basic civil law acts. And preparing for this conference, I made an inquiry on our Ministry of Justice at head of the Civil Law Directorate, and he said, okay, there's no idea there's no any ideas for amendment of these basic two civil acts with exemption of so-called rebus clausula, rebus sic stantibus rule. We have a quite important rule in obligation code regulating the clausula rebus sic stantibus, and the only remedy in case is to challenge the validity of the contract. What showed in time of COVID crisis and today in time of energy crisis as not a sufficient solution. There are, of course, some ideas how to manage this question, but the guy who is responsible for this act, he always said, easy. This is not a law which could be changed every year twice. Be careful and stay in line with general rules. Thank you for your attention.